3 people, and you're going to have 4 weeks. Do something.
It started out of pure stubbornness, which is great.
Without necessarily meaning to, I think we found this quite interesting niche.
No, we did some stuff, and the fact that it's invisible means it worked.
I think art is encoded knowledge and experience.
At that time, we were really fascinated by the whole transmedia concept.
That was it, not the time-travelling robot idea that we had.
Hello and welcome to Technique. I am Sam Fry, and this is the podcast where we speak to artists about technology. This is the first episode of 2020, and it's a good one. In today's episode, I speak to a coach, a facilitator, and a strategist that has done a host of work in the creative and cultural industries. I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Ellen O'Hara. I'm a freelance business coach and creative facilitator and strategist, and I work in the creative, cultural and social enterprise sectors.
Yes, today's episode is with Ellen O'Hara. I met Ellen a few years ago when we both worked together at Cockpit Arts, which is a social enterprise and business incubator for craftspeople. At the time, Ellen was the head of business development there, which involved her leading on the organisation's approach to coaching the, up to 170 craft businesses, plus any research and consultancy that the organisation offered. I wanted to use this opportunity to understand a bit more about Ellen and her approach to working in the creative and cultural industries, which has involved her working at places like Arts Council England, Nesta, British Council, School for Startups, the Prince's Trust, and many others. We end up talking about a host of topics, from supporting businesses, what it means to be innovative, the importance of social change, and why just getting started is often the best approach to innovation. So, lots to cover, in which case let's jump into the interview, which we recorded from IBM in London. So you've done lots in the kind of creative, cultural industries in general. Can you talk a bit about what drew you to that broad set of industry in the first place? You'll
probably understand as I explain more, my career path is quite wonky. And I started off in management consultancy. And I think it was more of a case of understanding that that wasn't where I wanted to be. And my personal interest was in the arts. So I just began looking for opportunities without really understanding how the arts sector worked, if I'm honest. And I was just very fortunate. I saw an opportunity at the Arts Council, which I applied for. It was in development and business development, which was a good fit for my skills. And it went from there. So it was really a personal interest, really, thinking how can I align my values better with what I do on a day-to-day, having followed a path that I realised wasn't quite right for me.
So what were you doing at the Arts Council initially?
Initially I was working within a team with the broad title of development, and we covered audience development, business development, diversity, so some of the cross-cutting agendas that all of the art teams were working towards. And so we worked on different projects under those headings, supported arts organisations to develop audience development plans, for instance. I had particular remit for community and participatory arts, which was very new to me, but I think something that really stuck with me. And the work that I undertook with those organisations, I still do a lot of that now, and I would describe that as kind of social change through the arts work. I still do a lot of that now.
What was meant by participatory?
Good question, yeah. I mean, I'm not an expert in this field, so I'm sure those who are experts will have a slightly different description to me. But essentially work that's engaging communities, and individuals and communities, to use the arts in particular ways. So it might be, say, engaging older people through photography or storytelling to explore either issues that they're facing or challenges, or even just a therapeutic or as a means of community cohesion. So the art's part of a process, and the the outcome in terms of the art that's made is still valid and valuable, but it's also about the process and bringing people together.
And do you think that's what was drawing you into the arts in the first place, or do you think that was an outcome of doing the arts council
It was an
work?
outcome, actually, and I think I knew that I knew I had a personal interest in the arts. I knew that I went to galleries. I knew that's where I would go when I needed time out. I kind of fell in love with contemporary dance at university, which I was exposed to at university, but I'd never considered it as a career, and actually it had never been suggested to me as a career. And I would never have been an artist, but I was totally unaware that there were roles in arts management or leadership or cultural policy. That stuff it just never occurred to me. I was on a completely different trajectory. So some of it was quite surprising, and I was kind of feeling my way. So most of the time I never really knew what my next job was going to be. And I would discover an area that I thought, oh, that sounds really interesting. I'll have a go at that next.
Because we met at Cockpit Arts,
Yes.
and at that point you were doing business coaching
Yes.
for craft businesses, and
Yes.
also some general development work for Cockpit Arts as
Yes.
an organisation. Between that, you went to the Prince's Trust,
That's
is that
right,
correct?
yes.
And so what was it, that participatory concept that brought you to the Prince's Trust, or did you have a different agenda at that point?
Yeah, in part, yes. So there was some crossover of agenda there, because some of the participatory work was specifically with young people. So that became a particular interest. So working with young people to enable them to achieve whatever they want to achieve using creativity. But I also realised at the Arts Council that I much prefer being at the coalface of things. I like direct delivery as much as I like strategy. I like to get my hands dirty. and also I began to understand how challenging it is for artists to make a living. And I just thought it just seemed like a really big gap. There didn't seem to be many people talking about how to actually pay the bills. The project with the Prince's Trust was new. It was an Arts Council funded project, so I became aware of it while I was working at Arts Council, and I applied to run the project. It was quite groundbreaking, really, because it was one of the first creative industry startup programs in the country, and it was specifically with young people. And I just felt it was a really good fit. So it kind of drew on my kind of business interest, but also the social impact element was really strong. So it was probably the first time I started to understand how important those two things were. The creative aspect is almost like, it is part of it, but it's not arts for art's sake. It's kind of looking at how creativity can enable people to work for themselves, doing what they're good at, hopefully making some social impact along the way. I didn't go into Cockpit as an expert in contemporary craft by any means. I had worked with designer makers at the Prince's Trust, so I had a good foundational knowledge, but I wasn't, and I'm still not, an expert in any specific discipline. I would never claim to be that. But I think there was something, again, just from personal interest that drew me in. I think my dad was a collector of glass. Nobody particularly famous. It was or high value, but we used to spend weekends trawling around antique markets and auctions or going to studios and that kind of thing. And I probably didn't make that connection until much later. It wasn't something that was at the forefront of my mind. It was probably only when I started working at Cockpit that I realised I had quite a lot of objects in my house, and I perhaps didn't see the connection until I look back retrospectively. But there has always been a personal interest there. I still have a lot of glass now. Glass and jewellery is my thing. And I think what's always really interested me about making is it's like many creative practices, it's really challenging to make a living because you're restricted by how much product you can make unless you go into manufacture. As opposed to some digital creative practice, it's much easier to scale. If you've got a market, then the kind of practicalities of growing a business is a lot more straightforward. But when you're making ceramics or glass, half of which will probably explode in the kiln, it's a different problem to solve. And I found that really fascinating, exploring how each of the different disciplines approach that. So, and I probably didn't understand the ins and outs of every craft practice until I got to Cockpit. But it gave me that opportunity to have a look under the bonnet and see what was going on.
If you're working with creative people whose work is very craft focused, there's so much of them in their work, which I guess is true for any creative, artistic person, but especially so when they're physically making stuff.
Absolutely.
So there's almost
an embodiment of them, really. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's an emotional connection between them and their work, and them and their business, and their business is often them.
Yes.
So it's a very different model to something else where, you know, growing is bringing more people on or doing less making.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And actually, you know, it does all begin with self-expression, really. And so just from a kind of an economic point of view, it's a complete supply-side business, which has its challenges. But as you pointed out, actually, when you're working with someone who's really driving them with their own passion or their own research ideas or their own practical skill or their own story about how they started doing what they were doing, for me, it makes the whole process of helping to build a business like a million times more interesting, because you've got this fascinating story and incredible skill, usually, you know, more often than not, to work with. So the product is there, you know, and the story is there. And that's probably what keeps me engaged. I think that's why I've always stuck with the creative industries in its broad terms, because you just meet so many fascinating people.
The other thing I guess you were doing when you were at Cockpit was that business development side, and
Yes.
Cockpit Arts is a business incubator.
Yes.
So it is all about growing those businesses or helping them to develop what they do. And my understanding of what you've done since then is a lot of work around incubation in general.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that kind of work and what you do now and where you've gone from Cockpit?
Yes, so I'm now self-employed, and my practice is quite varied, actually. So I do still work on programmes where I'm directly coaching artists and creatives, and that's really important to me. I've probably done that for about 20 years now. Sounds like a long time when I say it out loud. But it's really important for me to still do that work and work directly with people who are making work. And so I still do that. And then I work with other organisations that want to develop incubators and accelerators. So I've worked on projects with the universities. A few years ago, I was a coach and designer for the Digital Arts and Culture Accelerator with Nesta and Arts Council and the Accelerator Network. So that was a fascinating project, looking at how we might apply a tech accelerator model to arts organisations that want to launch digital products. That was a bit of a world first, so that was great fun. And I work with Nesta and British Council now on a programme called Creative Hubs Academy. So it's not an accelerator as such, it's a slightly more flexible model, but it supports leaders of creative hubs to develop more sustainable hubs so that they can support more people. It's a kind of intensive training program, and then some what we call learning in action. So there's not a pitch at the end, but there's some of the other elements of an incubator. So I think there's this huge scope for taking the different components and looking at how you can apply them to different organisations. And then the other work I do is with arts organisations. So I do some strategy development with theatres, galleries, museums, usually with a focus on building entrepreneurial capability. And I think my strengths are when they actually have a product to launch, or we want to look at how they might develop a light kind of internal incubation process. So I haven't yet managed to convince anyone to launch a full lab or internal corporate innovation thing, but light versions of that. I feel quite at home doing research and strategy, but I much prefer it when it's attached to a real-life project.
You talked about the work with Nesta. I guess arts organisations looking at technology and almost acting as a tech accelerator for arts organisations. You said that was an interesting project. I'd love to hear what were the good things about that and where were some of the struggles.
Sure. I mean, as a programme overall, I would say it was a great success in terms of testing a model. Each of the participating organisations started and finished at very different points. And I think that was probably one of the first lessons, is that everyone was at slightly different stages in terms of their idea development. So some were still at concept stage and others had already tested a prototype and were much further down the line. And I think our original ambitions were to enable investment readiness, and actually most of the participants, it was too early for them. I think they probably almost needed a pre-accelerator. Having said that, they all gained a huge amount from it, and I think that particular programme had a great combination of the usual kind of workshop content in the traditional intensive 12-week programme, and I think that journey was challenging for some. It was a lot to fit in when you're not just working on that business all the time. So I think the participants were usually leaders from an arts organisation who were also leading this particular digital initiative, and so they were having to go back to their day jobs in between, which was really challenging. But I think they all achieved an incredible amount considering they were juggling these two things. What was really essential for that programme was a lot of wraparound coaching. So we had the workshop programme, and then myself and a chap called Paul Sturrock, who supported the participants in between workshops and then for 2 months afterwards. And the demo day was later. So the accelerator took place over the summer and the kind of pitch day was in the autumn. We needed a gap to give them time to breathe and go back to business and apply as much as they could, and that gap was really important. And I think just the cohort learning was really important. And all of them reported huge increases in kind of confidence and knowledge and skills. Some pivoted completely. Some decided that actually wasn't for them and that they could apply what they'd learned to their core business to make a bigger impact. And that was quite interesting. So yeah, we learned a lot. I don't think we would ever run it again in that way. I think my personal reflections were that the process, or aspects of the process, can be applied really well. And I think working towards a pitch of some kind creates momentum and a discipline to actually work through, not just theoretically work through, but do the work. And I think that's one of the really powerful things about accelerators. You have to do the work. You have to make the phone calls and make the prototype and do the stuff. So you really do get to test rather than it just being a training experience. I think for organisations that are already running, unless there is a dedicated team, it needs to be spread over a much longer time period. More of an incubator than an accelerator, really, I would say.
It's difficult enough for any business to go, I'm going to dedicate this person or this team to doing something that they're not employed to do today.
Yeah.
So many arts organisations
who are already usually at full capacity, we're using their resources brilliantly, but very little or no capacity for new opportunities. And I think that's one of the challenges for arts organisations. There's no lack of opportunity. And there isn't even a lack of money, I would say, although lots of people would argue that that's not the case. It's actually just not having any human bandwidth to run with new ideas. And I think one of the conversations that we would regularly have is how can those organisations or those individuals, when they go back, just look at all of everything in their portfolio and create some space for innovation and create some space for opportunities so that they can respond to new opportunities as they come through, rather than being maxed out all the time, which is usually the case.
The other challenge with innovation is that in times where things are tight, that's the first thing to go.
Exactly, yeah.
So even if there was an intent to go, right, we're going to dedicate this person or a percentage of someone's time to doing something, then as soon as it's crunch time, they're like, okay, ditch that, and it's quite hard to pick up again.
Exactly. And it's also really hard for those organisations that receive funding from development agencies or trusts and foundations, which is the majority. They're usually tied into a kind of a contract to deliver X programme. And so it's quite challenging to deviate from that and say, actually, we're just going to work on something that's a lot more experimental, and to justify to themselves and to their board and to their funders, why that's happening. And I think we're getting better as a sector, and I think funders are getting more confident and working in that way and funding more experimental approaches. we've got a long way to go, I think, in terms of how we kind of measure the outcomes of more innovative work, which is so ironic to me, because making work is all about risk and innovation. Artists do that brilliantly. It's one thing they do better than anyone else, yet it's not translated into business practice very well.
The other thing we were talking about a little bit before was design thinking, or I mentioned it, and I think that's an attempt by businesses in general to go, well, how do we get everyone to be a bit more creative, a bit more user-centred, and actually, if you are at the coalface and you are creating work that you're directly having people engage with, whether they're buying it or viewing it or whatever, then you're naturally having some kind of cycle of innovation and adaptation.
Absolutely. And I think, the design industry has done a brilliant job at kind of packaging up its approach in that way. Business industry, however you want to describe it, can learn just as much from the rest of the arts and cultural sector, who, as you say, do that every day. So they live and breathe iteration and all of the things that we want to try and encourage a bit more of. There's nothing more grounding than your dress rehearsal or your scratch session where you're kind of inviting feedback from audience and members, or even just your team, and that happens happens all the time. And I think a lot of artists, not all, but a lot of artists, they wouldn't necessarily describe themselves as entrepreneurial, but if you break down some of the qualities and the fact that, yes, there's research, but there's definitely a bias to action, and there's definitely really high levels of resilience, and I think there's definitely a high degree of feeling really comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty and all of these things that when we talk about creativity, what does that really mean? To me, it's all of that stuff. It's problem solving, and it's about acting when we don't know what's going to happen next. And I think that practice we see all the time.
How much do you find yourself working around that notion of culture change as well? Yeah,
it's another area that I would say I would never describe myself as a, inverted commas, kind of expert in culture change or even organisational development, and there are agencies who that's their main business. However, because a lot of the work I do with organisations is looking at how they can be a bit more entrepreneurial, for instance, it's explicit in that work, and because I'm not a culture change theorist, my approach is always to, well, let's do a project, let's do a thing that's going to enable us to practice all the things that we want to get better at or change. So if that's about developing insights more frequently, or if it's about observing what our customers actually do when they come into our venue, or if it's about let's just do it, let's just make a project where we can just start. And that's my personal approach. It's probably not as structured as some kind of culture change consultants, but I guess it's the nudge approach. If we just start doing something, then we can develop the practice. And I think that's always my approach with entrepreneurship. You can't teach it, but you can learn it. It's like leadership. It's a practice, so you can learn it by doing. So theoretical research is important, but actually we just need to get started.
Something else I wanted to ask you about was you were on the Claw Leadership Foundation, so talking about leadership in the arts. Yes. Can you talk a little bit about that? But also, I guess you start through a programme of a certain period of time, but are you still involved in that in some way? How does that work, and has that impacted your way of looking at your role within coaching either individual businesses or organisations? Yeah,
it's hugely impacted me and my practice. It was the catalyst for me going freelance, actually. So when I applied to join the Claw Leadership Programme, I was at a pivotal point in my career, and I was trying to explore what was next. So did I want to go and be an exec director in a big institution, or did I want to become completely independent or somewhere in between? And it was a genuine question. That was a question I wanted to answer. And it became clear to me quite quickly that it was the independence. I think I'm much more effective when I'm on the outside, kind of poking inwards. I think I work much better in that way. You can be more challenging and supportive. I think I went freelance during my fellowship. I think I quit my job partway through. I don't think I would have been able to do it did I not have the support of the network at the time. And my particular CLAW cohort, we're all still very close. It's a really valuable support network for me. Though we do a lot of co-coaching and action learning between us, which is just brilliant. And I also now deliver the strategy training for the CLAW Leadership Programme and the short course. So it's been fantastic. And one of the great benefits of a programme like that is it's quite self-directed. So there are some chunks that you will go through, but you can choose to develop your leadership capability in whatever way you want. So for me, it was partly looking at where does someone like me fit? Where are the Ellen-shaped holes in this sector? Because I very rarely saw a job description that I thought, yes, that really plays to all of my strengths. And that's really why I went freelance in the end. But also I did some research, some of my own research, which is an ongoing thing for me. I should turn it into a podcast, but I haven't got the capability. Just understanding what entrepreneurial leadership is in the arts. What does it look like? What shape does it take? Because I think when I speak to, not all, but often when I speak to leaders in the cultural sector or artists, they have a perception of what being an entrepreneur is, and it's often quite a negative one, not always. Or it's a sense that it's a kind of Alan Sugar type character, when actually, entrepreneurs come in all shapes and sizes like leaders do. So I think it gave me a great opportunity to interview some brilliant people and meet brilliant people who I think demonstrate entrepreneurial leadership in a whole host of different ways.
Yeah.
So it's been brilliant for me. Big up the CLAW Leadership Programme.
I mean, that's why I do this podcast as well.
Yeah.
For the same reason. It's good sometimes just have an excuse to talk to people about whatever.
Yeah.
You talked about going independent, partly to be able to be an outsider, because that gives you, I guess, some flexibility. I wonder also if, and maybe this is me portraying my own feelings about things, but sometimes you can get a lot of resistance to change or try new things. And if your mindset is very much around, let's go and do something and then evolve on top of that, doing something can often be really hard to get going. So actually being individual and doing your own thing means, well, no one's going to stop you doing your thing.
Yeah.
So you do that, and then you encourage others on the way.
Yes.
On the way where you feel you can help.
Yeah.
Whereas I guess if you're part of an organisation, whatever organisation that is, or supporting an organisation, there's structures in place which can be a good thing, but can prevent that happening. Is that something you feel as well? Or
no, absolutely. I mean, I think I learned shortly after I graduated something that I didn't realise, which is that I need a lot of autonomy and flexibility at work. It hadn't occurred to me. It wasn't until I was working in quite a big kind of corporate environment that I felt the strain of that. And although I didn't get that immediately in my next couple of roles, I think I've always been working towards that. And I think it's important to try and demonstrate how beneficial it can be for organisations to give their staff autonomy and to think about, obviously within some boundaries. And not everyone wants to work in that way. Lots of people want to have a lot more structure, and that's fine. But I think if we want to be creative truly, we have to give people space, and we have to look at our kind of lines of authority and where they stop and start, and be a bit more flexible about that. So I think sometimes I can best demonstrate that by being it. And if I'm consulting to an organisation, I will usually try and just spend the time in the organisation. So I'm not a arm's length consultant, and that's quite important when I'm working with people for us to understand what that relationship will be like, and that it will be a collaborative one, and that I want to work with them in the organisation, because I think that by osmosis, if nothing else, then the work that we do together can start to have an impact that way. Yeah.
what are some of the projects that you're working on at the moment? Is there anything you can talk about?
So I mentioned the Creative Hubs Academy just before, so that's more of a kind of training development programme. I've just finished a brilliant piece of work with an amazing organisation called Theatre Centre, and that was through a programme with School for Social Entrepreneurs. And they were looking at launching a new product called Switched On. So Theatre Centre are leaders in the field in terms of enabling young people to have agency and develop leadership through theatre. And they also do a great deal of work in schools and wanted to combine that expertise to develop some new products and services. So they created Switched On, which responds to the PHSE agenda. And it's a pack for teachers with an audio radio play and learning materials, all digital. And so it was great to have an actual product for them to launch. So we did our kind of product development stuff, and they did some fantastic research, and they launched their pilots and then launched the product itself, which is selling well. And through that process, we're able to develop their own kind of entrepreneurial muscle, if you like. And since then, they've hired somebody into an enterprise and development role, which is just a brilliant outcome because they've really kind of dedicated not just resources to it, but organisationally committed to that as a really key part of their strategy. That's a really nice example, I think, of a complete journey, and good luck to them. I'm working on a project with Warwick University through Warwick Ventures, which is slightly different. So this is not so grounded in the arts and cultural sector, but it has similarities which I thought would be interesting to share. And it's working with researchers, so PhDs and kind of doctoral researchers, to look at how they can apply their research in a business context, either through the development of a product or a service or through a collaboration. Been applying lots of kind of startup principles and design thinking stuff and to work with researchers so they can explore where the impact of their research might be. And then out of that, I'm working with one of the projects, which is an arts project actually, and it's kind of an artist network. And it's been a really interesting journey for me because I think the similarities between don't want to make too many sweeping generalisations, but between some researchers who are so heavily research-based and some artists who are often also very research-based, very ideas-based, and looking at the similarities and differences in a journey that they might go on to look at how their work can have an impact in the world, what the purpose of their work is and where they want it to be and where they want it to be positioned. And it's been really brilliant. So that's been going on for about 18 months. What else am I working on? I know I'm very busy.
You sound very busy. You're finding that researchers, their outlook are quite similar to artists. You think you'll be drawn to do more in that area or not?
This time of year, so beginning of January, I always have a period of reflection and I look back at all of the projects I've worked on and think about what I liked about them and what didn't go so well and what I want to do more and less of. And I would like to do more with research, but when I think about my kind of Venn diagram of stuff, there has to be social impact at the core. That has to be part of the package. And I think as I move forward, that's becoming clear and centre to me that ideally everyone I work with is really driven by social change primarily. So whether that's through research or through arts and creativity or something else, that's the point in the middle that's becoming very clear in my focus. So the answer is yes, provided that it's about social change. Definitely seeing more activity, tackling a whole myriad of challenges and kind of local issues, and the arts can play a great role in that. But I think there's also lots of standalone stuff going on. I mean, I was thinking about this recently, and I was trying to reflect myself on. So somebody was asking me what's so important to me about enterprise development, because they know me well and they know my politics, and that I'm probably the least commercial person they know in terms of kind of, hardcore corporation capitalism. And I was asking myself the same question, and I think one of the reasons is because whether it's a project or an actual business, I think the practice of generating an idea and testing it and selling something and all the other skills that you learn through that process develop so much confidence and agency, even if you then go on to do a job or elsewhere. I think it leaves you with a kind of set of skills that you can apply to a whole host of different things, and whether it's community organising or at a big scale, or even, or just a small project, they're just skills that they're hard to come by in any other way. Even if you do like young enterprise at school, it doesn't quite gear you up for it. That's probably the best opportunity that you might get.
What you were making me think about was the fact that you are doing quite a lot of work with universities. And so the thing I was doing before I went to Cockpit was I was involved in entrepreneurship at University of Bristol. And I had a job there for a year or so doing entrepreneur support. So it was societies to do with entrepreneurship. So there was a social enterprise society, there was an entrepreneurs self-run society, but there was also a business incubator for students, and there was the coaching around that. And their whole thing at Bristol was about, we don't care really if there are businesses that come out of this. I mean, it'd be great if there is a flagship business that we can say that student went here and they started it while we were here. Isn't that amazing? But what we do care about is having a bunch of students leave who are all self-starters, kind of go-getters, who will go and start their own things, because we know whether they're entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs or whatever, they're going to go and do some stuff. So the fact you're doing lots of work around the university, actually, that's not everyone has the privilege of going to university, but that is a great space to do that, because people are potentially willing to try new things, and if it fails, fine, they're still studying.
Absolutely. And actually, just before we were kind of mapping out what some of the outcomes of this university-based accelerator might be, and understandably the university wants to see businesses surviving, or at least new products, but we spent quite a lot of time mapping out, if we were to break down some of the capabilities that we want to foster, what might they be? And actually we're going to measure against those primarily. I mean, there will be some hard outcomes, but we want to see, will this process, does it enable someone to have clarity of their vision? Does it enable them to feel comfortable with uncertainty? Does it enable them to improve their problem solving or their confidence around relationship building or mobilising others, or all of these things that you'd expect a brilliant entrepreneur to be able to do? And not everyone will develop all of those skills or develop all of those capabilities, but they will definitely hone some of them. And then, as you say, whatever they go on to do with those next, they're all super valuable. And some of them are just really valuable life skills. I think particularly feeling comfortable with uncertainty and risk, and understanding your own risk appetite and what you need to take a step is such a valuable life lesson that no one else can really teach you. And you might not even be aware of how important that is until you start to understand it. And it underpins so much of your decision-making in life, that where you sit on that scale. So I think being able to develop some self-awareness around that is really important.
And if we could come to share the pride and joy, the way we share the power of mind's voice. Falling asleep should feel like falling in love. Feet on the floor feels good enough.
There you go. That was our interview with the wonderful Ellen O'Hara. It was really nice to have the chance to catch up with Ellen and find out what she's working on, as it's always interesting. She didn't give me anything specific to plug. However, I would say that if you are working on any kind of enterprise program in the creative industries, or even in the world of social change, then you should definitely reach out to her. She is on Twitter, which isn't a bad place to start, and her handle is @EllenMaryO. So, that's it for this month as we kick off the new year of episodes. We have some great interviews planned, so while you are here, please do subscribe so that you can hear more in the future. I will, of course, be back again in a month's time. In the meantime, take very good care of yourself. Goodbye.